What's going to happen in China next week? Well, the truth is, I don't know. Still, I will try to sum up the situation currently. What's going on in China? What is the good stuff and the bad stuff for us invested in Chinese stocks, but also companies that have a big market share or big implications from what's happening in China, like Apple and Tesla. So first of all, I think it's no doubt that currently there is a pretty tense situation. So let's start with the bad news here, which is that, for example, we had the news and the pictures and the footage coming out from China about the Foxconn plant, which is manufacturing, for example, iPhone devices for Apple. And yes, there has been uproar, and parts of it has been due to COVID-0 restrictions, but overall this was also mainly a mismanagement situation there, where because the factory is going into a so-called closed loop production, where people are actually remaining within the factory, sometimes sleeping in this certain district, and they cannot move out, and there have been issues with hiring and double hiring and so on. So in sum, a total messed up situation. And this escalated into what I perceive are some of the most violent or longer lasting riots, protests, if you will, in China. If you compare it, for example, to some of those protests around the Evergrande situation or the bank deposits, I think that wasn't as big as this situation right now. Plus, on top of that, the situation continues. We had an issue in Urumqi, that's the Xinjiang region, where supposedly 10 people, unfortunately, at least 10, that's the official number, have died in a fire because they were in a lockdown situation, and it seems that the rescue couldn't proceed just because of that. And what is new here around this very bad situation is that I see on my WeChat timeline, for example, very, very clever, very smart protest happening, highlighting the situation. So that's coming from people all over in China or living abroad, that they are watching the situation, and they are also protesting against the fact that, of course, some of this will be censored in some ways. So there are very subtle and smart ways of still voicing their views, that what is going on right now is, in their views, not the way that it's supposed to happen. And that also the fact that people cannot freely talk about it is an issue. So you usually don't see such very large scale, really more like a mass movement types of social media posts in China, along with, of course, there have been demonstrations locally in Urumqi, but we also know that there are more and more cities that are currently struggling with enforcing zero COVID policies, as the cases are spiking all over the country. So you see such kind of quarrels. People are questioning whether or not it's legal that they are locked up, and people want to leave in some cases. But, for example, also the case of the Foxconn plant highlighted how people are actually truly still afraid of the virus itself. So they demand actually that the whole situation is getting managed better. And so China and the government is currently in a very difficult situation, because on the one hand side, you have those tensions that are building up that I've just described, that are vented on social media, for example, or in protests locally. And then on the other hand, you have the cases actually rising. And so we saw, for example, what happened in Taiwan when they abandoned their zero COVID policy. Of course, also with that, you saw the death toll rising. And this is also putting pressure on the medical system. And so this is the big conflict to manage here, where in the past we've seen very clear signs that China is trying to open up at some certain point, for example, reducing quarantine restrictions. We had very nice pictures of Xi Jinping going overseas to the G20, not wearing a mask, and that was really a good message to the world, and I think it was perceived like that, and I think we saw that in a strong rally also in Chinese stocks. However, what I don't think is going to happen is that China overnight is abandoning zero COVID and will, just unleash it and let the virus run through the population. So instead, I think it's much more likely that we will see continued lockdowns and also continued measures. And unfortunately, with that, in that current tense situation, as I've described it, more protests locally and increased tensions. And so while this might be really bad news for us invested in companies like Tesla, NIO, Apple, who clearly are affected by something like this, like if there is a protest going on at Foxconn, that's not good for Apple. There might be news coming out next week for NIO and the factory, for Tesla, the Giga Shanghai. There might be new measures put in place. We don't know. That could happen certainly overnight. But somehow this is also creating this new challenge that the government must really manage somehow. And therefore, it might actually be necessary as a step of opening up, as weird as this sounds, that such kind of things like those events are currently happening and that there is footage of that leaking and so on, because in the end, the government will listen to such events and, think of ways of dealing with that. Of course, always weighing all of the benefits and the issues against each other. However, in the end, if there is more tension in the population, then it's also getting more likely that these strict measures cannot go on like this forever. Because this will generate more voices like those critics right now on social media, which use the tools available as far as it's possible with censorship to raise a voice. But there are even articles like this on official newspaper sites that are, starting to raise the right questions, in my point of view, questioning how far those regulations can actually go. Also, what is the impact, for example, on the economy? How is the rest of the world already living with the virus normally? And that's currently getting very prominent for the Chinese watching the World Cup. And so, all of this is possibly part of this ongoing progress with 2 steps into the front and 1 step back of changing the situation on the ground after 3 years of zero COVID policy. And so I'm not entirely sure if the policy will be abandoned to its entirety. I think that would be a too big call to make. In the short term, I would rather see an enforcement and still trying to prevent a larger spread of the virus and hopefully being able to get through this winter without any further issues there. And then the overall strategy seems to be that like just more like on a compound level. There are quarantines that need to be adhered to and stuff like that. But usually they're trying not to have a huge damage, like entirely cities locked up and manufacturing places locked up and things like that. So we possibly see a lesser impact on the economy going forward, but still not really the full opening that so many investors or people, China watchers, people from the West are actually anticipating there. However, now going to the good side, I think there are also very, very good signals lately, especially from an investor perspective. For example, this first rally in Chinese stocks after the first signs of a loosening of those policies, were actually quite sustainable so far. So despite major issues, everyone saw the cases rising, right? Despite that, the stocks have held up quite a bit. And that's, I think, because also the macroeconomical conditions have changed a little bit. So we have lots of Chinese companies reporting currently in this earnings season, and they're largely beating both on the revenues and the earnings estimates of the analysts. So usually, and that's quite in contrast to, for example, some of the US stocks and counterparts there. You see after earnings that the stocks are usually green and rallying a little bit, not always holding their gains. However, you remember a couple of months ago after earnings, usually a stock would get cut 25% after earnings easily. And now there seems to be a bottoming out really happening there in terms of that lots of the economic hit is priced in, and the companies are actually starting to work in this new environment. For example, Baidu now having pretty solid earnings, to be honest, and for the outlook, of course, they are still very cautious all of the time, mentioning the impacts of the policies, but also expect for 2023, and that's where investors are looking to, that there should be an improvement. And yes, of course, this is still a very, very big issue for companies directly impacted like NIO and Tesla, who have manufacturing plants that could be shut off, or delivery centers closed down, or people feeling less incentivized to actually buying cars right now. So these impacts are really still there. But my sense is that overall macroeconomical conditions are really getting a little bit better. The US dollar has finally started to roll over, and might actually show that this is a trend change there. Also, the FOMC minutes, I read them in its entirety, and my take is that this is really one of the most, let's say, defensive reports there by the Fed, and it may actually start to get backed by real data. So the first inflation prints that are coming in a little bit lower, the first time that we see jobless claims are actually going up a little bit, and the economy not performing that strong in the US. And so I think investors shouldn't really expect like this pivot by, for example, the Fed and saying, tomorrow we're going to print money again, or by China saying, tomorrow everything will be open again. But rather, I think it's now the situation that the economic realities have been priced in many ways, and are seeming to heading towards a trend change, in my point of view. That's my very broad observation here. Of course, going forward, that needs to be confirmed many times over and over again. But I would say, just thinking in probabilities, I would say the probabilities that inflation is actually getting solved within the next couple of months is actually higher now than it was ever before. The same for China opening up. I think the prospects are getting higher and higher each day, even with such kind of protests. I think we're edging more towards an end of this in some sort of form, that it will have a huge impact on the economy going forward. Although in both cases, the situation as of now, I think, is quite uncertain still, and very messy, to be honest. So what should we expect next week? Well, most likely more negative news out of China, maybe some more protests, maybe some more lockdowns, things like that. And maybe also on the economic data front from the US, maybe more negative news as well. However, I don't think that this might ultimately be the end of the world, and we'll see how the stock market is really reacting to that. If it's rather forward looking and seeing this as this bottoming out and ending of a process of some very large trend that we have seen for a very long time, or if there is actually even much more downside, both for the US as well as risk assets and Chinese stocks. So that's usually the basket that I'm looking into. And currently, I would say, yes, there's lots of bad news out there, but we also need to be aware about those positive aspects and what's actually realistically happening there. So that's my take. Let me know yours in the comments. Please feel free to share this video and like it, and subscribe to the channel if you haven't yet, or consider becoming a patron and support our work. Thank you guys for watching, and see you in the next video.